Professor Harsh V. Pant. Today we'll be listening to him about the reframing of India's foreign policy priorities in an emerging world order. As we all know, this is a very important topic which is of high contemporary relevance, and we can't think of a better person to talk about this than Professor Harsh V. Pant, who is an expert on India's foreign policy, a well-known scholar within India as well as outside India. So I will just ask Professor Dr. Nankishore, head in charge of the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations, to give his opening remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Anand, and a warm welcome to Professor Harsh Pant. Perhaps I think this is his first interaction with the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations. Professor Harsh, Department of Geopolitics and International Relations is perhaps the only department that teaches geopolitics in India at this juncture. And also it was started in 2010, much prior to that one. Professor M.D. Nalapad is the brainchild of M.D. Nalapad. This whole department is all about. There were 1.5 and 0.2 track dialogues that were happening much prior to that one. Now we have just completed 10 years and we have our first year, second year, as well as our research scholars in the meeting today. And apart from that one, we also have some other guests who have also joined. So they're all keen to look at you. Now, given the type of topic that we have, we thought one of the things that India was going through is the type of change that we are seeing in certain foreign policy orientations. This is the second term that the Modi government has got. And there are different challenges that have come, one in the form of pandemic. Second is also India accepting greater roles. So we thought a topic of this sort, when we framed it as reframing India's foreign policy priorities in an emerging world order, essentially after a long time, we have a Minister for External Affairs who knows his job. That's the first point. Second is also the amount of experience that he has is phenomenal, and he's been leading from the front. In fact, the whole polemic that we are talking about, if you look in, he's typically looking at that national interest of India, which is put forth as being aspirational, operational, as well as polemic at the justification level. So that's how his book has come as a very important intervention. Apart from that one, certain statements that he has made, where he made a mention some time ago, and even in his book, that we are now at the cusp of change with more confidence. The pursuit of seemingly divergent goals and the straddling of contradictions are being attempted. Taking risks is an inherent to the realization of ambition. Now, this is a loaded statement that he made some time ago, which sounds that India is ready to take up responsibilities. India wants to do certain things because he thinks somewhere a nation that has the aspirations to become a leading power someday cannot continue with unsettled borders and unintegrated region, and also an underexploited opportunity that are available. But he also meant in a later stage where he said, above all, it cannot be dogmatic in approaching a visibly changing global order, which people like Rajamohan have also said that India has slowly started learning the grammar of international politics, grammar of how the world order is functioning. So precisely for this reason, we thought the best person that we could think of was Professor Harsh Pant, and he readily accepted to deliver this lecture. I'm really grateful to you, sir, for having accepted to talk to our students and then subsequently take the questions. So without standing between you and the audience, I would probably want to stop it here, and then Dr. Anand, please take this forward from here.
Thank you, Dr. Nankishore. But first of all, I would like to give a formal introduction to Professor Harsh V. Pant. Although a lot of our students here do know about Professor Harsh, nevertheless, it is my duty to introduce him to the audience. So Professor Harsh V. Pant is the director, studies and heads of the Strategic Studies program at Observer Research Foundation, ORF, in New Delhi. He holds a joint appointment with the Department of Defense Studies and the King's India Institute as a professor of international relations at King's College London. He is also a non-resident fellow with the Wadhwani Chair in US-India Policy Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Washington, D.C. He has been a visiting professor at the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, a visiting professor at the Center for Advanced Study of India at the University of Pennsylvania, a visiting scholar at the Center for International Peace and Security Studies at McGill University, and an emerging leaders fellow at the Australia-India Institute, University of Melbourne. Professor Pant's current research is focused on Asian security issues. Some of his very important well-read books include New Directions in India's Foreign Policy, Theories and Practice, India's Nuclear Policy, the US Pivot and India's Foreign Policy, Handbook on India's Defense Policy, India's Afghan Model, the US-India Nuclear Pact, Policy, Process and Great Power Politics. Apart from that, he has written a lot of articles in various journals, Indian as well as international media outlets, including some of the very famous newspapers like the Wall Street Journal, the Japan Times, Hindustan Times, and so on. And he always, of late, has been appearing a lot in a lot of these webinars, which has been happening, especially in this COVID era. And because of that, I think all of you are very much aware of Professor Harsh's viewpoints. But nevertheless, let's hear from the horse's mouth what he would like to talk about India's foreign policy in this emerging world order. So, Professor Harsh, your talk will mostly be around, let's say, 30 minutes, and after that we can have a Q&A session with the students and the rest of the audience. So, Professor Harsh, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anand. Thank you, Nand Kishore. And I think this is indeed my first interaction with the department, and I've heard a lot about it, and I have interacted with various people associated with the department in individual capacities. But this is the first time I'm interacting formally with the department. So thank you for having me. It's always wonderful to be able to talk to students and colleagues who work in the same area and who are interested. I look forward to having an interaction. I will speak for a few minutes, around 25 minutes, and then I think an interaction with you would be very, very useful, and I look forward to that. Indian foreign policy, any foreign policy of any country is always evolving. It's never static. Even if we think conceptually, it is static. Operationally, tactically, it has to evolve constantly. And so the question is whether nations and states can actually be proactive and shape the emergence of a new order, or they simply become subjects of an evolving order. So in a sense, you want to be a passive recipient, or you want to shape an emerging order. That's the question that all policymakers are confronted with. And the global order that we are talking about today is, of course, at an inflection point. I mean, you don't have to be a student of international relations to know that. Even if you are reading your newspaper every day, even the fact that we live in a world shaped by COVID-19 alerts us to this reality that the world was changing even before the pandemic struck us. But what COVID-19 has done is to accelerate and accentuate some of the fundamental trends that were shaping this order. And if you take this, that perspective, then I think some of the questions that the global order is facing, some of the questions that perhaps Indian foreign policy is facing, become that much more explicit to all of us. So I'll briefly talk about, before I come to Indian foreign policy, I'll briefly touch upon some of, in some ways in which we can conceptualize the emerging order, and what do we make of it? If you recently, I think earlier this week only, Prime Minister gave a speech in Parliament where he made this point about COVID-19 and how we are in a new world order, and that new world order will emerge, and whether India wants to be part of it is up to India. And I think that's a very important point in the context of some of the things that Dr. Nand Kishore was saying, that for policymakers to be alert to this possibility that a crisis is also an opportunity, that what COVID-19 did to India and to the world also presents India and the world an opportunity to reframe, reshape, reconfigure the global order, is a very, very important aspect of policy-making discourse. And as students of international relations, as students of IR, as students of public policy, perhaps we should be aware of of what that how that prism evolves, and we should be aware of the challenges and the constraints that accompany any such move. So I think the fact that Prime Minister is alert to it, the fact that, as Dr. Nand Kishore was saying, the Foreign Minister is alert to it, gives you some sense that perhaps India today, more than any other time in recent history, also wants to shape global politics, global order. But what is this global order that we are talking about first, and before I come to India? Now, if you're looking at the global order today, and how, if you want to assess global order, while one can say, oh, COVID-19 has done this, COVID-19 had done that, I think the reality is that even before COVID-19, the global order was evolving in a certain direction. The questions were the same, whether you're looking at structural changes, whether you're looking at institutional problems, whether you're looking at normative challenge that was being posed. The questions that we are asking today were the same even in the pre-COVID-19 phase. What COVID-19 has done is to sharpen those tendencies, is to bring more focus to those questions and to those issues, which perhaps were bubbling up but not had yet come to the surface. And today we know that they have come to the surface in many ways over the last 8 to 9 months of what has happened in the global order. So structurally, the reality that we face is of great is this idea as to what kind of an international system are we moving towards? The structure of the system. Is it what I think everyone agrees is that it is no longer the unipolar moment of early 1990s. But where are we moving to? Are we moving to a bipolar world where America and China will become these two bookends around which the global politics might revolve? Are we looking at greater fluidity in the system where we are not sure what kind of a multipolarity are we confronting? After all, one can argue that European Union remains a certain kind of a power, where Russia also remains a certain kind of power, ready to use that power to certain ends. India in its own way is trying to project a certain kind of leadership. So what are we moving towards? And there is a great fluidity in the system and that perhaps is one of the reasons why flexibility is a term that is often used today. That we don't want to be in situations where we are taking off the options from the table. So clearly this idea that the international structure is evolving and evolving rapidly is a question that we have been asking even before COVID-19. But what COVID-19 has done is to tell us that whatever the architecture of that international system might be, international structure might be, the fact that China is playing such an important role today has to be looked at squarely frontally. That you have a power today that is rising and that has almost risen to a point where it can challenge the fundamentals of the extant order. So that power needs to be looked at, analyzed, confronted, and managed. Now, the debate on China was there even before COVID-19, but the COVID-19 over the last 10 odd months, 11 odd months, we know the way China has shaped the global narrative, that China has pushed its agenda on the global framework, and the way the contestation between China and the US has sharpened. That has it provoked a certain sense of anxiety and caution in a large part of the world. So what we are looking at is this trajectory of China becoming the most fundamental fault line in global politics. China has achieved much in the last several decades, but what Chinese behavior today, especially in the last few months, has indicated is that China will play by its own rules. And so when you have a power of the size of China not willing to integrate into the system, it's then the questions arise about the viability of the international order. So in that sense, there is that dynamic happening between about the rise of China, but it is also happening at a time when perhaps the West, when the US and the European powers are more and more inward looking and perhaps at their weakest in terms of the domestic political consensus about their global role. So if you look at the trajectory from Mr. Trump to Biden, when Mr. Trump was there, we could all project the problems of the world or problems that America is bestowing on the world onto Mr. Trump's personality. But there is a fundamental issue here beyond Mr. Trump and Mr. Trump's personality, and that is the fraying domestic political consensus about America's global role. And that is very visible when you read Mr. Biden's speeches, when you look at Mr. Biden's approach to global politics. One of the things that Mr. Biden and his team has been uttering relentlessly is that every single foreign policy venture of Biden administration will be decided on, will be factored on the grounds as to how it helps American middle classes. Now that's a very, very strong sense of the Trump factor moving into Biden administration. That Mr. Trump, what he did was he elevated the domestic political concerns into the American strategic narrative. And while Mr. Biden may have a very different worldview compared to Mr. Trump, the fundamentals on which he's going to do his politics has not changed. And that is that the American middle classes have become more and more important for American political discourse, which means that American foreign policy will have to take into account the anxieties and the challenges that the middle classes are facing. And those anxieties are shaping American response to the world. Perhaps we will, the ideas about American interventionism, the idea about unfettered free trade, the ideas about globalization, perhaps we are already seeing an altering of that narrative, and this is going to continue even under Mr. Biden. So clearly, the inward orientation in American politics is not simply a Trump factor. This is an American domestic political factor. Similarly, if you look at the European Union, the challenges in Europe are so huge, gargantuan, that you have a situation where the European Union, in order to become a credible geopolitical actor on the global stage, will have to first figure out what to do with the domestic disarray. And there is a lot of domestic disarray in European Union. It is not simply Brexit. Brexit is one part of it, but you also have a problem in terms of northern and southern economies, in terms of the trust deficit widening, in terms of the vital consensus on what kind of a role EU should play. So you have a situation where the French want to do much more in the Indo-Pacific, whereas the Germans want to engage China much more substantively. So that dissension within European Union is challenging the fundamentals of European Union's posture on the global stage. So the contestation that we are witnessing today between an emerging power like China, which is so much more confident of its own assertive power, assertive behavior, and a growing inward orientation from the West, will have significant consequences for the global order in which we live in. And for India, and I'll come to India a bit later. I'm just trying to lay out some of the global order issues first. So this is one structural challenge. There is another structural challenge which is related to what I was just discussing, and that is the changing consensus on globalization. So this attempt today at looking at globalization again through a domestic prism, that while globalization of the early 1990s was a good thing, that perhaps the integration among world economies was a good thing, it has created certain discontents which are very difficult to manage. And that is something that is going to be part of the larger global order discourse for the foreseeable future. Again, this was something that initially everyone focused on Mr. Trump, that Mr. Trump wants to take away, it wants to make America deglobalized. But today, if you look around the world, and especially what happened after COVID-19, is that more and more countries are becoming inward-looking economically, in economic terms. Economic nationalism is on the rise. So you can go back to early 1990s when the Francis Fukuyama's end of history argument was that from now on, liberal market, free market capitalism and liberal democracy will spread around the world. You have almost moved to a 180-degree position where now the argument is that perhaps we will never see that kind of an arrangement come to fruition, and perhaps the costs of globalization for domestic politics, for democracies in particular, are becoming difficult to sustain. So while globalization has done a lot of good, the kind of challenges it is posing now are becoming unsustainable. And I think that is a very important point to understand when we are looking at the larger global realities, because deglobalization is now the norm. All countries want to retain economic autonomy more and more, especially what the experience of the world has been with China. The experience of the world has been with during COVID-19, and the costs of over-dependence on China are becoming more and more visible. So that's one aspect of deglobalization, decoupling from China. The other aspect is domestic costs are becoming unsustainable. So what Mr. Biden calls the middle class consensus, the middle class test for his foreign policy, is actually targeting the benefits of free trade, for example. So how do you develop domestic manufacturing? This is a debate that Americans are having. This is a debate that Europeans are having, and this is a debate that Indians are having. So in a sense, what we are looking at today is a very, very different picture of the structural reality that we confront, both in terms of the geopolitics as well as in terms of geoeconomics. And China, as well as the fraying domestic political consensus, have played a very, very important role. The other element, a related element of the global order, from the structural to the institutional, that when you have so many challenges at the structural level, it is inevitable that the institutions that were created to sustain that international order will crumble under the weight of their own contradictions. Now, again, you can go back to pre-COVID-19 days when the debate on the unsustainability of the institutional order was already coming up to the fore. We were looking at how UNSC is becoming more problematic. We were looking at creating new institutions like G20 was created because G7 was not working. We were looking at the problems with WTO. But what happened post COVID-19? These questions become almost very difficult to ignore. And the most vivid example, most blatant example, was how WHO, World Health Organization, was misused by China at a time of great global crisis. So while the debate was theoretical in some ways before COVID-19, post COVID-19, the debate is much more operational and real, that you have now a situation where even a crisis like this magnitude, we have found our global institutions unable to manage, unable to rise up to the challenge. And those of you who listened to Indian Prime Minister's speech to the UN last October, he was also very clear. He also challenged the United Nations, that where was United Nations when this crisis was raging? So we have seen international institutions almost falling apart, not being able to respond to a crisis of this magnitude. And remember, this is a crisis which we call in the literature a non-traditional security crisis. This is not even a military crisis. If in a crisis where everyone agrees global cooperation should be the norm, like health crisis, if even in this crisis we have faced so many challenges in ensuring global coordination, you can imagine a crisis of a military kind. as to how our institutions would factor there. So clearly, the pressures of the structural realm are being witnessed now in the institutional realm. Our institutions are unable to work, and this applies to all institutions. We have seen that happening to NAFTA, for example, the trade agreement there. We have seen it happening to European Union. We have seen it happening to SAARC, for example, in our own vicinity. We have seen it happening to ASEAN. That across the world, whether these are regional organizations or global organizations like UN, WTO, WHO, G20, G7, whatever, most of these platforms have been found wanting. So institutional problems have become more and more acute and have been accentuated by this crisis. And so the challenge would be, how do you rectify this problem? How do you make sure that you have better institutions or alternatives available? The third element, of course, is the normative aspect, where normative challenges have been equally profound. So again, when you look at how are you going to shape the second generation of normative discourse, because one generation, the first generation, came in the aftermath of the Second World War. And a lot of codification happened, a lot of international institutions were managed, were created, normative structures were created to underpin the institutional and global order problems. But today, that normative consensus is breaking down. That normative consensus is being challenged. So whether it is being challenged in the maritime space, as far as the maritime law is concerned, whether it is being challenged in cyberspace, in the nuclear space, we know what is happening with the bilateral START agreements. We know what is happening with the NPT. We know we have to every day new norms and new architectures have to be created to sustain this. JCPOA was a response to that challenge. The nuclear deal with Iran was a response to that challenge. That Iranian question could not be dealt with within the confines of their traditional architecture, and we know what has happened to it. We know how difficult Biden administration is still finding to get on board. So normative consensus has also broken down in terms of what do we do with the global order issues. And therefore, as a reflection, we can also look at free trade, for example. Trading issues are also, the consensus on global economic arrangements are breaking down left, right, and center. That something that was seen as a given 2 decades back is now under question. Some of the biggest votaries of globalization at one point in time are questioning the benefits of unfettered globalization. So clearly, the normative consensus is breaking down, both because you have a great power contestation, where countries like China and Russia are pushing their own agenda, which have a very different view on fundamental issues of democracy, human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and you have the extent, even those countries that have laid the foundations of this of this arrangement are finding it difficult to convey to their own people how important that is. So at every level, structural, institutional, normative, we see this flux, we see this change, we see a global order in flux, and we see how we are moving towards a position where the older paradigm no longer is adequate, but we have not found the new paradigm to construct alternatives. And I think that is where India comes in, and that is where India's arguments become important. That is where India's leadership becomes important. And that is why when you have when Indian leadership says that for the next our agenda, Indian foreign policy's agenda for the next duration, for the next time period, is to emerge not as a rule taker, but as a rule maker. And this is the time, because older rules have broken down, new rules have not yet been created. And so you have that space for a country like India to emerge as a rule maker and to emerge as a country that can provide solutions to global problems. And in some ways, especially in the last, during the COVID crisis, India has shown that it has the ability to shape that kind of a discourse. And in that sense, what we term as what is often termed as middle power diplomacy, middle power engagement has been very, very interesting, because if you look around the world today, you will find that the bigger countries, China and the US, European Union, they faltered. But the countries that actually did very well in this crisis were countries like Taiwan, like South Korea, like India, which have actually done much better than was anticipated much earlier. And so this provides an opportunity in terms of leadership. And India has taken leadership in many ways. You can go back to India's call for the SAARC meeting, despite the challenges that SAARC has posed to India. India went ahead and called a meeting of South Asian countries. India also called for a meeting of G20. India was the first country to call for that, even calling for a UN Security Council meeting at that point in time. So India clearly was very vocal about the need to have a global response to this problem, even when major powers were looking more and more inwards. Aligned with this, India has been very, very vocal about helping others, providing solutions. So whether it was supplying emergency medicines to other countries during the early phase of COVID-19 or PPE kits, or now the supplying of vaccines to various countries around the world, India has taken the lead despite its constraints, despite the domestic scale of the challenge that it faces, that India would like to be a provider of a public good, in this case, public health, global health, and that allows India to shape the discourse on public health in this particular sector in some interesting ways. But there is something else which is happening, which is also that, if you look at the larger challenge that has come about, which is the China challenge, and for India, the China challenge coincided with the COVID challenge. That has also allowed India to use this opportunity to construct new paradigms in some ways. So on the domestic front, what we have seen is a greater push towards indigenization, greater push towards reducing economic dependence on China, greater push towards creating alternative supply chains with countries like Australia and Japan, a global supply chain resilience initiative, for example. And this it is doing at a time when there is an economic crisis, there is a strategic crisis with China, and there are larger issues of public health. But as I said at the very beginning, this crisis also presents an opportunity, and this is an opportunity that perhaps India is willing to tap. So that is one aspect of how the domestic challenge has been framed into a foreign policy challenge. The other aspect is, if you look at the institutional framework, if you look at the institutional challenges, institutions are not working. And that is something that India has conveyed. India has been repeatedly saying this for the last several decades, that major institutions of the world are not working, that the world will need to redefine the structure of these institutions. And what has India been able to do? India has been able to push for reforms, for reformed multilateralism, but that will happen when it happens. In the meantime, if you look around the Indo-Pacific, for example, what are we witnessing? We are witnessing the emergence of minilaterals, plurilaterals. Now, these are issue-based alliances, issue-based coalitions of like-minded countries, where countries are trying to figure out that if you do not have an overarching structural institutional umbrella, how do you respond to this challenge? Now, we do not have an Indo-Pacific institutional architecture at the moment. But countries of the region can't just wait and watch, because you have to respond in real time to China's challenge. And so the minilaterals, the plurilaterals, it can be a trilateral, a quadrilateral, all those aspects are emerging from bottom up. That even if, for example, America may be less interested, even if America and the West are looking elsewhere, the regional countries can come together. They can work towards a new, possibly a new architecture. Now, again, it will take a lot of time to become more formalized, but that's what we are witnessing. In the absence of larger formal structures, we are looking at the emergence of smaller structures, and India has played a very, very important role in that regard. First, by underscoring and underwriting the concept of Indo-Pacific. Today, if Indo-Pacific is an idea, as a construct, has been bought from United States, European Union to Southeast Asia and East Asia, a large part of it is about India, India's persistence, India's consistent outreach on Indo-Pacific. And it is very interesting that if you look at the Chinese approach on the Indo-Pacific, Chinese have been very vocal about the disdain for Indo-Pacific. But at an ideational realm, the fact that most countries today are adopting Indo-Pacific is a defeat for the Chinese. That the idea of Indo-Pacific, which they tried so hard to discredit, is now very well accepted around the world. It has become part of our nomenclature. Even academics are looking at it, and it has become part of the academic discourse, policy discourse. So that is the larger reality in which we are looking at the engagement from India, and we are looking at the role that India has played. So in that sense, the reframing of Indian foreign policy perhaps has to acknowledge the emerging trends, the emerging crisis, the challenges, and the opportunities that it brings for Indian foreign policy makers. Some of the opportunities have been tapped into, partly because the crisis was so severe, and partly because the leadership today is more inclined towards using that as an opportunity. Some of the opportunities, like how do you operationalize some of these ideas into formal processes, into formal outreach, and into formal products on the ground, that remains still a work in progress. But what is important is that as we enter a new inflection point in global politics, as we enter into a new phase of global politics, India should not see itself merely as a country that can avoid making some hard choices. Those hard choices will have to be made, because it is not simply about India today, it is also about what kind of a normative and institutional global order do we want for us, for India, for Indian foreign policy priorities, that can help India grow, that can help India prosper, and that can help India secure its vital interests. And unless we are willing to not only sit at the high table and contribute to that discourse, it would be very difficult for the rest of the world to take us seriously as they had done in the past. There is still this mindset about India that when it comes to the crunch, India avoids taking decisions. And that mindset is changing gradually. But I think this crisis of today provides that opportunity where Indian foreign policy priorities can be framed and reframed and reconfigured in ways in which India is not only engaging directly with the rest of the world, but also making a case to the rest of the world that its role will remain coherent on a sustained basis, not only because that is important for India, but also because that is important for the kind of global order India would like to see, in which not only India prospers, but also India's friends and India's allies prosper. Now, I will end there and open this up for a broader conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Harsh, for that very enlightening lecture. Now I would ask the audience, including the students and the external participants, to ask any questions which you might have regarding this particular theme to Professor Harsh. Yes, Mr. Ayan Ali, you can ask your question.
Thank you, sir. Am I audible, sir?
Yes.
Yeah. Good evening, Professor Pant. It has been a pleasure listening to you. So I'll come to my question. So, sir, from your lecture, and obviously I have been keeping a note of India's foreign policy throughout the pandemic, and it is very clear that India is an emerging power, and we have a very big role to play in the post-COVID world on the international forum. So, coming to the context, with reference to this context, the developing world is considered India's natural constituency. And it's not only during the COVID-19 pandemic, but from past 3 to 4 years, we have seen that how China is growing its footprint in the developing world, be it in Africa, be it in Latin America, or in our immediate neighborhood. Given what happened between India and Nepal, what is happening in Sri Lanka, what is happening in Myanmar and Bangladesh. So, sir, given all these developments in the developing world, do you think that reinventing NAM and regenerating NAM can help us to tackle the China challenge, especially in our neighborhood? Thank you.
Sir, can we take a few questions together and then answer? Yeah. Okay. Veenu Sharma, can you ask your question? And before asking the questions, please identify yourself.
Good afternoon, sir. Myself, Meenu Sharma. I am a second year student in the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations. It is a great pleasure to hear you, sir. I always listen you on Big Picture and India's Worldview or the debates, but listening in department is a different feeling altogether. So, sir, for my dissertation theme, I am working on multilateralism in India's foreign policy. So I have a few questions on it. So first question is regarding with the Prime Minister Modi's statement, which he made in the UNSC, like India's absence from the decision-making infrastructure and lack of genuine reforms might force India to look for alternatives. So when it comes to alternatives, what exactly Prime Minister want to say? Like if we look at, am I audible, sir?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if we look at in the present context, there is no other international organization which can replace UN. So what exactly Prime Minister means here with the alternative? And the second question is, as you rightly mentioned about willingness and capabilities. So does India have the willingness and the capacity to take up global responsibilities needed to match its global aspirations, because domestic and international factors affects India's capability at the multilateral institutions? Thank you, sir.
Srikutan?
Thank you, sir. It was a pleasure listening to you, sir. I'm Srikutan. I'm from the first year, and I've been working on India-Russia for my term paper. Thank you for the presentation, sir. It was a pleasure listening to you as always, and I always look for your articles online. And this is regarding Russia. You in one of your articles, you have quoted that Russia always keeps improving like weapons, and it is one of the places where we can give cheap weapons, and we always have cherished our relations with Russia. But now, due to the Chinese influence, we are having a very difficult time. So, how do you think we can revive the relations with Russia, and how do we take in the Chinese factor? And we also see that occasionally they move towards Pakistan as well as kind of signaling. How do we counter all that while keeping our interests intact? Thank you, sir.
Sir, I think you can answer these questions, and after that we can take the other questions. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you all. I'll take them one by one. I think the question on the fact that China's imprint has grown. Ayan raised this fact that it is growing. That's a fact, and I don't think India can really compete in terms of economic resources that China can throw around. India really does not have that kind of a scale or the resources available. What India can do is alert its friends, for example, in Africa, in Latin America, and even in South Asia, to the possibility that that China's approach to some of these issues, to some of the to its aid program, etc., comes with a certain it comes with a certain cost. So in terms of India and China's approach to infrastructure development or to development aid, there is a remarkable difference, and the difference is that China's aid is more of a top-down approach. It's more of elite-centric approach. It does it hardly does anything for capacity building, whereas India's is more of a bottom-up approach, engagement with countries in Africa and Latin America, depending on what they want, not what India wants. And it's more of a participatory approach, that we are equal as partners, and let's decide you decide what is good for you. We are willing to help you as partners. It is also, aimed at building capacity, long-term capacity in these countries. So there are differences, and that's what India can highlight. India can make a case to these countries that, look, we are also available. But as I said, India does not have the kind of resources that China perhaps has. And in that context, what I think India has been trying to do now for the last few years is to engage in partnerships with third countries. So we have had India, Japan, for example, collaborating, in South Asia. We have had India, Europe collaborating in Africa. And that is, I think, the model that perhaps India would like to follow, because it does not have the kind of resources. And it also, let's be honest, India's credibility in terms of delivery is rather poor. We are very good in terms of announcing projects. We are very bad at delivering them on time. So clearly there is a gap in terms of the expectations that countries have from India and from China. And so what India has tried to do is to partner with countries that have greater credibility in delivery. So Japan, for example, is well known. European Union is very good in delivery. So we can partner and we can make sure that our strengths are leveraged by each other. Now we will see how that approach works, but that's something to think about when you're looking at India and China together trying to figure out the developing world. Now, whether NAM can be of help, I'm very doubtful, because non-aligned movement really, it is for a very long time we have seen a decline in non-aligned movement, and not many of these countries, for example, take non-aligned movement seriously. So the non-aligned movement as such, I don't think can be an important vehicle for talking about the challenges that we face today. Non-aligned movement was a platform for a certain kind of discourse at a certain point in time when these countries had decolonized and when the country. Am I audible? I thought I lost.
Yes, sir, you're audible. You're audible, sir.
Okay. So I don't think non-aligned movement can be a platform, because it was created for a particular purpose, for a particular idea, and there were certain issues that it wanted to propagate at a certain point in time in global politics. The world has changed. The discussions are changing. Even in Africa, with whom India has had such a great relationship because of anti-colonization movement, etc., they don't want to hear some of the older paradigms. The youth in Africa is looking at the 21st century with a very different set of glasses, with a very different set of narratives. And India will have to figure out how to engage with that youth on contemporary terms. I don't think NAM can be that platform. The issue on multilateralism, you see, this is going to be a very, very important issue for India and for the world. What do we do if the existing institutions of multilateralism are not working? Now, India, as you mentioned, Indian Prime Minister's speech, I think what Indian Prime Minister perhaps was trying to say was that if, India has, we have been talking about reforms for so long. We have been told that reforms will come, but nothing happens. Now, if this trend continues, then people of India will give up on United Nations. And also the fact that you have 1.3 billion giving up on a platform like United Nations will be a big problem for UN, because then it means that the UN's credibility itself will suffer. If you have a country like India deciding not to take United Nations seriously, then it is, the credibility of UN as a global platform goes down a bit. So in that sense, I think Prime Minister was making a statement that, look, we have to think how can we make UNSC, UN Security Council, or United Nations more effective, more relevant to 21st centuries, more representative of 21st century realities. What was set up in 1945 cannot be reflective of what is happening in 2021. So that challenge is there for UN to change, to evolve in a direction where it becomes more representative of the world. It is, the irony is that the only Asian country sitting there is China. And if you look at the Indo-Pacific today, you have a situation where China does not really represent Asia. Now, if that is the context in which we are living today, then certainly, UN will have to figure out what they want to do unless they want to lose their credibility. I think that's the push that Indian Prime Minister was making. And as I said, already we are witnessing a lot of these discussions on security issues, etc., being taken away by other platforms. If you, for example, let's imagine a situation where Quad becomes a very, very important platform in the Indo-Pacific. It is not today, but there are attempts to make it more relevant. And if it becomes important, then what will the situation be? That all your security issues will be dealt with at Quad or Quad Plus, where like-minded countries would come and join it. Now, if that is happening, and then United Nations Security Council's relevance goes down in the Indo-Pacific even more. And I think that's a challenge for UN, and that's a challenge for countries like India to convince UN as to what can and cannot be done. India certainly has the willingness to do much more on the global stage, but in capability terms, it is limited. Capabilities are what they are. But I think the issue that the world is facing today, that even those countries that have capabilities, what are they doing? So you can look at the West, which is crippled by internal dysfunctionalities and not doing as much for global order as it should, or as it was expected to do. You also have a situation, a country like China, which is which is supposed to do much more, but is doing it in a very negative way. So clearly, for a country like India, this is an important opportunity to do limited work, but also to make it, to bring its role into a greater, sharper relief. And that is what India did, for example, has done during the COVID-19 pandemic, where it has tried to position itself in a certain way, where countries have taken. It's not that India has been supplying medicines on that big a scale. Whatever we have been doing, we are trying to do our best within a limited capacity. But the recognition that India got for it is quite significant. When UN Security Council, when UN chief says that, Secretary General says that, look, India is the center of a global response to COVID-19, it tells you a certain story about India, that despite its challenges, despite its constraints, India has been willing to provide solutions to global problems. And I think that's a change that we are looking at. India-Russia ties. China factor is going to be with us in every single respect. And I think while defense ties remain the bedrock of India-Russia relationship, the fact is that the China angle of the Russia triangle, if you have India-Russia-China triangle, the China-Russia bit is becoming more and more dominant in Russian foreign policy, because Russia is looking at its foreign policy through the prism of its anti-Western posture. And that means that the only country that can help Russia there is China. So it's very unlikely that the Russia-China relationship will become weak in the foreseeable future, given that the West is not interested in engaging with Russia at the moment, which means that it will have costs for India. Now, India's relationship with China has become explicitly adversarial. So for India, it will be a great tightrope walk between Russia, with whom we have defense relationship, and a very substantive one at that. And therefore, when the crisis started with China, if you go back last year, the first visit that Indian defense minister made was to Russia to ensure that if a conflict happens, the supplies, the supplies from Russia remain on board. So the China-Russia relationship is not going anywhere in a hurry. What India can perhaps do is to make a case to Russia that ignoring India would also have consequences. So I think India has made an effort to bring Russia into the Indo-Pacific fold. Now, again, the Russians are not interested. Russians are towing the Chinese line on the Indo-Pacific. They don't recognize the Indo-Pacific. They view Indo-Pacific as a Western ploy to target China. Whereas for India, Indo-Pacific is more nuanced. But given the kind of equities that Russia has in China relationship, that is going to continue to be a challenge for India. There is going to be a challenge. So India will have, given the limited constraints, given the constraints that India has, India will have to continue to engage Russia. But if we expect India-Russia relationship to return to the Cold War days, that's not going to happen. We can take more questions.
Yes, Mayank,
Very good afternoon, sir. Thank you so much for your talk. So I had two questions. I'll try to be very brief with them. Firstly, sir, I read your comments recently on military modernization, and I was hoping to get your views regarding the same. So firstly, sir, what do you think is the largest roadblock that India faces in terms of military modernization? And secondly, sir, a lot of commenters have also said that the problem is so far largely budgetary. So do you agree with that? Or do you think that there are other reasons that are also causing problems in military modernization? And secondly, sir, I had a question regarding the recently declassified US document. I think it's titled the US Strategic Framework for the Indo-Pacific, in which the United States looks at India as a very vital security provider for the region. So, sir, I was hoping to ask you that just the way the US looks at its security process as something that's very cognizant of India's strategic capabilities. Sir, do you think that our security conceptions and our security strategies are also equally intermeshed with the United States? Thank you so much.
Yes, next question by Anupama. Anupama? Or if Anupama is not available, Partha Basu? Okay, I think there is some connection issue. What about Malavika? Can you ask your question?
Hello.
Yes.
Hello.
Yes,
is it? This is Partho. Yeah. Good evening, Professor Pant. It has been a pleasure hearing you. I'm a research scholar with IGNOU. My question is that how best India can assume a leading role in international geopolitics in reference to her own evolving domestic socio-economic and political scenario. Thank you, sir.
Yes, Anupama, your question?
Am I audible, sir?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, sir. Good evening, sir. My name is Anupama. I'm a PhD candidate here at the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations. So you highlighted several elements of the world order, including institutions and norms and so on. So when you talk about China as a factor in bringing about changes to the prevailing global order or a new world order, are we talking about a new world order or a change in distribution of power capabilities with China replacing the US and going on to function exactly like the US? In which case, I mean, distribution of power is also an important element of global order, but is there a fundamental change there? Another thing that comes to my mind is that the notion of state, the idea of state in IR was under significant challenge before COVID. And COVID seemed to kind of bring the focus back on state centrality in what kind of actions could be taken and what results could be got out of the same. So do you see the idea of state itself undergoing a change or being challenged under the new world order paradigm? Thank you so much.
One last question by Malavika.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for that extremely insightful talk. My name is Malavika Markholkar. I'm from the first year in the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations. I'd actually like to ask questions on behalf of my classmate Daksh, who cannot seem to work his mic. I have two questions on behalf of him. The first is, how can we be more involved in the Afghan peace process? And the second is, which is a question I also had, is to how can we develop capabilities to have a more rule or order shaping role as you suggested?
Okay, Professor Harsh, you can answer the questions.
Thank you. Again, I'll go back as I receive the questions. The military modernization bit. This is, I think, this is a fairly interesting, issue, and it continues to generate a lot of discussion in India, perhaps rightly so, because we are looking at some of the more real-time challenge on the military front to India today than we have ever seen. China is on our border today, and the China-Pakistan alliance is at an all-time high. So you have a two-front war situation, which is a challenge. But whether budget is an issue, I don't know, because we will never have enough, budgetary issues are always going to be permanent. We will never have a situation where a government can satisfy every single stakeholder in the military realm in terms of the budget it provides. We will always have individuals, organizations who will say that this is not enough. And what is enough? So clearly the question is, I don't think it's about budget. I think it's about effective utilization of that budget. Whatever budgetary resources we have, how best we utilize them, given our strategic priorities. So the first question I think that Indian policy planners should be talking about is what are our strategic priorities, and how can we then use those resources towards a certain end. I think that conversation is beginning to start and is beginning to happen, and that's very heartening. But we still, I think, at times confuse means and ends and ways. And we are not very good in terms of articulating a strategic rationale for the budget. So you have, we can have individual services can debate what they want. Navy will want aircraft carriers, Army will want more strike corps. You will have Air Force, which will want more fighter pilots. But at the end of the day, what is the national priority? And that priority needs to be specified. And that is, I think, the government's role to specify that. Government will always have to look at multiple stakeholders. Government will have to provide for multiple people resources, multiple stakeholders, and military will be one. So military will be one, and that that needs to be taken into account when we are talking of budgetary resources. And so I don't think budget is an issue. I think budget we will always have problems. I think it's the utilization of that budget that can be made more effective. It can be how we think about our options that will become more effective. No country ever has enough money always to secure its military interests. You always have to fine-tune your resources. You always have to fine-tune your strategy, because you have to bring your ends and ways and means into balance. That's what strategy is all about. India and the US security enmeshment, yes, certainly I think we are both nations are working more and more together. But India has its own set of priorities. America will always have its own set of priorities. There's this debate in India as to whether America can be trusted. There's this debate in America how far India will go. I mean, these are all in some ways redundant debates, because if our vital interests are in sync, if our strategic end goals are the same, then we will find it difficult. But even if we find it difficult, we'll figure out a way of working together, and that's the issue at the moment. India's role in terms of whether global order and India. See, India's all politics is local, and this also applies to this is Partho's question. Also applies to India's role on global politics. At the end of the day, unless there is a domestic consensus in India about India's global role, we will always have problems in terms of how do we articulate it, how do we budget for it, how do we situate ourselves on the global stage. But there is an argument in India that, oh, don't worry about the world, because you have so many poor people to take into account, you have so many domestic problems to take into account. But that that I think is a false debate, because the world is not going to wait for you to set your own house in order. You cannot remove inequality completely. You cannot remove poverty completely to take a global role. A global role is expected of you because the world looks at you today through a different set of lens. All countries in the world, all powers in the world, as they have risen, they have played a greater role, irrespective of the challenges they continue to face, domestically. Domestically, America remains a badly conflict-ridden society. But it continues to play a certain kind of a global role. China remains a badly unequal society, a highly unequal society, but it continues to play a global role. So I think there are limits to which your domestic problems shape your global posture. And I think that is something that India will have to take into account while trying to manage on the domestic front. India will also have to articulate a global response, because that is something also linked with your domestic politics. You want a suitable global environment in which you can allow the potential of an ordinary Indian to flourish. And that is why you'll have to take, Indian policymakers should take the lead. It is not simply about India trying to position itself on the global stage, but position itself for the well-being of their own citizens. And I think this needs to be more categorically argued and articulated to the people. I think Mr. Modi has been one of those rare prime ministers in recent times who has done that, but I think it needs to be done on a much broader basis, that foreign policy is also about domestic politics. The China, certainly distribution of power was what I was talking about, in the structural realm. Anupama's question. I don't see China displacing the US, but I think the question that you are raising is very valid. That is the question entirely, that if China becomes the most important player on the global stage, then what kind of a global order, what kind of global norms are we looking at? What kind of a global agenda will it push? So certainly distribution of power is inherent in the way structure evolves, and who sits where, rise and fall of great powers traditionally determines the global order. And that is what we have been talking about. Now, the idea of the state, this is a very good question. Idea of the state certainly has undergone a dramatic transformation. There was a time, I don't know how many of you have read, but in 1980s, London School of Economics political economist Susan Strange has written this book about the state, where she argues that sovereignty of the state is moving upwards, sideways, and downwards because of multinational corporations, NGOs, and other organizations are taking away sovereignty from the state. Now, if you look at state today, you look at a state that is again much more powerful, and we have seen the state coming back in some ways post financial crisis, where people demanded that state take responsibility, that market forces are controlled. So this argument about state and the market and state and other actors is really being reconfigured today, because I think on a lot of fronts you see state coming back to the center stage. So I don't think state is going anywhere. State capacities are now seen as very, very pivotal in managing whether it's a health crisis, financial crisis, economic crisis, or whatsoever. Finally, I think Malvika's question of Afghan peace process. Afghan peace process again is a term that is we have been hearing about it for so long, and we know that India's and nothing much has come of it. India's response has been quite clear that if they would like the Afghan peace process where all stakeholders are involved, where it is Afghan owned and Afghan led. The question is what kind of a role India will have eventually. Once this deal is signed. At one point, it seemed that the Afghan peace process is coming to a conclusion. Under Trump, he wanted to withdraw dramatically, but we have heard that Mr. Biden wants to take a more conservative approach to that question. So I think what India can possibly do is to make it clear to the Americans and also to Afghan stakeholders that India has certain red lines that will need to be respected. And I think that's what India has done. In some ways, India's position has been that we will support the government, whoever the government is in Kabul. If they want to proceed with the peace process, we will support it. If they want to take a break, we will support it, but they have to decide what they want to do. India and no other country should be in the driving seat. Now, that's a message that has been conveyed. India has also been gradually trying to build bridges with certain segments of the Taliban, which are trying to come back to the negotiating table. But it is again a long way off, because we clearly don't know the contours of the arrangement that are being worked towards, that the Afghan process, peace process, political process is moving towards. There's still too many ifs and buts, but India's position has been that that the local stakeholders should be in the driving seat, and that's a position I think that the Biden administration has also taken, and they've also, much like India's concern, have taken a view that a dramatic withdrawal is not something that they would prefer. So we'll see how that pans out. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I would like to thank Professor Harsh Pant immensely for giving us or sparing his valuable time for giving his lecture to our students as well as the other sections of the audience. Thank you for your patience in terms of addressing each and every question in a very detailed manner, sir. And also, I would like to extend my gratitude for you by illuminating us through a very well-structured lecture. So it has basically been a very good learning experience for all of us, I'm sure. I would also like to thank Dr. Nandkishore for helping organize this particular lecture. I would also like to thank all my colleagues at the department who has also helped in making this lecture a success, as well as my students in the department who has asked very significant questions which could actually extend their knowledge about this area. I would also like to thank some of our alumni who has joined this lecture, as well as participants from our own institution, MAHE, and also other participants from other external organizations. So thank you all for joining in this distinguished online lecture, and I'm hopeful that we can see more of Professor Harsh's lectures in MAHE, if not online, but also not just online, but also in physical manner once the pandemic is gone. So thank you, Professor Harsh. Thank you for
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It was wonderful.
Thank you, Professor Harsh, and we look forward to listening to you many more times. Please go ahead. I think you have a program to catch up. Take care.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Dr. Kishore. Thank you, everyone. It was wonderful. Look forward.
Thank you, sir.